Some people post every meal, every sunset, every small win. Others disappear completely. No selfies, no stories, no updates. Their profile picture hasn't changed in 3 years. At first glance, it looks like nothing is happening in their life. But psychology suggests something far more interesting is going on beneath the silence. Because the decision to stay off camera isn't empty, it's a decision, and decisions are never random. By the end of this, you'll understand what this quiet behavior can reveal about personality, emotional regulation, and the way certain people relate to their own identity. Not everyone who avoids posting is the same, but the patterns underneath are far more consistent than you'd expect. Why we assume posting equals confidence. Here's the assumption almost everyone makes without realizing it. Someone posts constantly, a new photo, a new milestone, a new outfit, and we read that as confidence. Someone posts nothing, and we assume the opposite. Shy, insecure, maybe even a little sad. But that assumption doesn't hold up well under actual psychological scrutiny. Visibility and self-assurance are not the same thing. One is a behavior, the other is an internal state. And behaviors, especially online ones, are shaped by dozens of overlapping motives. Audience, personality, upbringing, even what someone had for breakfast that morning. A person could post constantly because they're genuinely joyful and want to share it. They could also post constantly because a quiet, uncomfortable feeling creeps in whenever they go unseen for too long. Both looks identical from the outside, a grid full of photos. Which means the opposite is just as possible. Silence can be low self-worth. But silence can just as easily be something psychologists find far more interesting, a stable, well-regulated relationship with attention itself. The psychology of privacy. There's a concept in psychology called privacy orientation, essentially how much a person naturally wants their internal world to stay internal. For some people, sharing feels like connection. For others, sharing feels like exposure. Neither is wrong, but they lead to completely different relationships with platforms built entirely around sharing. Consider a simple thought experiment. Imagine two people take the exact same vacation. Same beach, same sunset, same good day. One immediately reaches for their phone, framing the shot, thinking about the caption before the moment has even finished happening. The other watches the sunset, feels the moment fully, and never once considers documenting it. Psychologically, something subtle but important is happening in that difference. The first person is partially experiencing the moment and partially narrating it for an audience. The second person is only experiencing it. Neither experience is inherently better, but research on mindfulness and attention consistently suggests that undivided presence, engaging with an experience without simultaneously performing it, tends to correlate with deeper, more vivid memory formation and greater in-the-moment satisfaction. In other words, the person who never posted the sunset might actually remember it more clearly than the person who did. But privacy alone doesn't fully explain this pattern. There's a deeper psychological mechanism at play, one about where a person's sense of worth actually comes from. Psychologists often describe two very different sources of self-worth, internal and external validation. External validation depends on other people, likes, comments, views, reactions. It feels good, but it requires constant renewal, like a phone that only charges for a few hours before needing to be plugged in again. Internal validation works differently. It comes from a person's own sense of meaning, competence, and values, largely independent of whether anyone else is watching. This connects directly to self-determination theory, well-established framework in psychology, suggesting that lasting motivation and well-being come from 3 core needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness, none of which strictly require an audience. Someone with a strong internal validation system can complete something meaningful, finish a difficult project, go on a beautiful trip, hit a personal goal, and feel completely fulfilled without ever needing anyone else to witness it. The achievement is already real to them. It doesn't need external confirmation to become real. This doesn't mean people who post heavily lack internal validation. Plenty of confident, secure people enjoy sharing simply because they enjoy it. But there's a specific psychological signature worth paying attention to. What happens to someone's mood when a post underperforms, or when they realize almost no one is watching? Because that reaction reveals more than the posting habit itself ever could. Why emotionally secure people often seek less attention. Here's a pattern therapists and researchers frequently observe, though never as an absolute rule. People with high self-concept clarity, a clear, stable sense of who they are, often feel less pressure to broadcast their identity publicly. Self-concept clarity is a term from personality psychology, describing how consistently and confidently someone understands their own traits, values, and beliefs. When that internal picture is already clear and stable, there's less psychological need to have it reflected back through public approval. Think of it like this. If you already know exactly who you are, you don't need a room full of people to confirm it. But if that internal picture feels uncertain or unstable, external feedback can start to feel necessary, almost like evidence collection. Proof that the life being lived is good enough, interesting enough, worthy enough. This isn't a character flaw. It's an extremely common, deeply human pattern, and almost everyone experiences some version of it at different points in their life. But it does help explain why some emotionally steady people simply feel no internal pull toward documentation. Their sense of self isn't waiting on outside confirmation. However, that's only part of the story, because there's a well-known psychological process happening on the other side of the screen, one that platforms are engineered around. In 1954, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced social comparison theory, the idea that humans naturally evaluate themselves by measuring against others. For most of human history, this comparison was limited to a small circle: neighbors, coworkers, family. Social media didn't just expand that circle, it exploded it, placing curated highlight reels from thousands of people directly in front of us every single day. Multiple studies on social media use have found a consistent association between heavy platform engagement and increased social comparison, along with lower self-reported mood, particularly when browsing passively rather than actively connecting with close friends. Some people who avoid posting have consciously recognized this dynamic. They understand that participating fully in the comparison cycle, both posting and consuming, tends to increase anxiety rather than reduce it. So they opt out, not from insecurity, but from a form of self-protection. This connects to a psychological skill called emotional regulation, the ability to manage and respond to one's own emotional state in a healthy way. Choosing not to participate in a system known to elevate comparison and anxiety can for some people actually be a sign of strong emotional regulation rather than social withdrawal. But this raises an important distinction most people overlook entirely: the difference between someone who's quiet by nature and someone who's quiet by design. It's tempting to assume people who avoid posting are simply introverted. Sometimes that's true, but introversion and this specific behavior aren't the same thing. Introversion, in psychological terms, primarily describes where someone gets their energy, solitude versus social interaction. It says very little about self-worth or validation seeking. Plenty of introverts post constantly. Plenty of extroverts never post at all. What actually predicts low posting behavior more consistently, according to several personality-based studies, isn't introversion. It's high emotional intelligence combined with strong internal validation. Emotionally intelligent people tend to be highly aware of their own motives. If they notice they're about to post something purely to seek approval rather than to genuinely share, some consciously choose not to. This kind of self-monitoring is sometimes called meta-awareness, being aware of your own psychological state as it's happening, not just after the fact. It's the difference between feeling the urge to post and immediately posting versus feeling the urge, examining it, and asking, why do I actually want to share this? That pause, small, often invisible, is where a lot of quiet, camera-free lives are actually built. But there's one more piece of this puzzle, and it's chemical, not psychological. Every time a post receives a like, comment, or share, the brain releases a small burst of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in nearly every rewarding experience, from food to social connection. This isn't accidental. Multiple researchers studying social media design have described these platforms as being deliberately structured around variable reward schedules, the same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines so effective, where you never know exactly when the next reward is coming, so you keep checking. For some people, this reward loop becomes genuinely compelling, not because they're weak-willed, but because the system is engineered by teams of behavioral experts specifically to be compelling. People who post, rarely or not at all, haven't necessarily escaped this system through pure willpower. Some simply never developed a strong response to it in the first place. Others deliberately stepped back after noticing how much time and emotional energy the loop was consuming. Either way, stepping outside a system this carefully engineered isn't a small thing. It's often a quiet act of self-awareness, happening completely out of public view, which is, fittingly, exactly the point. Common myths about people who don't post. Before finishing, a few myths worth clearing up. Myth 1. People who don't post have nothing interesting happening in their lives. In reality, posting frequency has no reliable correlation with how eventful or fulfilling someone's actual life is. Myth 2. Not posting always signals insecurity. As we've covered, it's frequently the opposite, often linked to stable self-concept and strong internal validation. Myth 3. Everyone who avoids social media is antisocial. Many quiet posters are highly social in person. They simply prefer connection without documentation. Myth 4. This behavior is fixed and permanent. Posting habits shift constantly across a person's life, often tracking closely with changes in confidence, privacy needs, and life circumstances. Human motivation is rarely one single thing. It's worth remembering that some people don't post for deeply psychological reasons, and others simply find it boring. Both are completely valid. What really matters offline? Here's what tends to get lost in all of this. A well-lived life was never actually dependent on being witnessed. Long before cameras existed in every pocket, people fell in love, raised families, built careers, and experienced enormous personal growth, all without a single photo to prove any of it happened. The moments that shape us most are rarely the ones we document. They're usually the ones we're too present in to think about documenting at all. Real confidence isn't measured by how often people see your life. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't feel the need to prove they're living it. They've simply stopped needing an audience to know their life is real. If you've ever wondered why some people seem completely unaffected by what others think of them, while others feel deeply shaped by it, that's a psychological difference worth understanding, and it's exactly what we're unpacking next.